I did spend $40 on new equipment for my microphone, so hopefully the sound will start to improve soon, but it hasn't arrived yet. In this section, there are three photographs that I think kind of again underscore the idea of even though the Civil War was over, even though the 13th Amendment was passed, we're in the phase of Reconstruction where there were still barriers that would disallow blacks from really truly becoming free. We keep on coming back to that question, like, what does it actually mean to be free? The law might say it, but what does it actually mean? Because again, we have 4 million newly free blacks in the South. But what does it mean to be free? So the first image shows this idea of a carpetbagger. This would be the term given to Northerners who went south and attempts to help the newly freed blacks. Does this look like someone who's going to be helpful? Not really, even though we'll see actually that the carpetbaggers, there were people that went south who did good things. There were those who went south to do poor things. But this is the person who's part of the Freedmen's Bureau who is supposed to help blacks. Does he look like someone who's going to help? Not really. Most famously, a political cartoon showing the three pillars of the Democratic Party. You have an Irish immigrant, I believe, a Confederate veteran, and a Wall Street banker. What is uniting them all together, though, is again any attempts to push down the newly freed black men and women. This was the cornerstone of the Democratic Party at the time as they were fighting against the radical Republicans as they became known. These are the people who are fighting against the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. And then we still have Andrew Johnson, who is portrayed here as Iago in Shakespeare's Othello, who is the villain who brings down the Moor at that point. So here he is, guiding a newly freed black person, but clearly, he has other intentions. He never supported really the idea of Reconstruction. He still thought the states should take care of it themselves. But as we've seen from previous videos, in the post-war era, you couldn't rely on the state legislatures to enforce the 13th Amendment, later on the 14th. But there was a lot of really cool stories to come out of Reconstruction. An earlier video said mostly it was a mess, but that doesn't mean to say that there weren't stories of triumphs. So first, again, there were interactions between carpetbaggers were Northerners who went south, and scalawags were the terms used for Southerners who cooperated with the Northerners. There were lots of teachers that went south. There were lots of business deals made in the South and intended to, again, rebuild the country because this is no longer, well, this is back to being the United States. So attempts were made to bring the economic power of the South back into the North. So there were positive interactions. There were some people that just went for themselves. In the South, laws would be passed that would allow males over the age of 21 in the South, whether black or white, to vote as long as they weren't former Confederates. But you can imagine how that made a lot of white veterans, white Confederate veterans, imagine how they felt, right? Regardless of whether or not they owned slaves. First and foremost, they probably didn't own slaves. But they lived in the South and they were being told that they couldn't vote because they had cooperated in the Confederacy. But now the 4 million blacks could vote. Many of them didn't like it. Again, this idea of voter suppression that we saw earlier, this wasn't happening because, again, this figure here is a Union official. During Congressional Reconstruction for 10 years, there were troops in the southern states ensuring that blacks could vote. In South Carolina, we'll see a really cool story of that in a couple years, ensuring that blacks could vote in Alabama and in Tennessee. Again, Andrew Johnson thought that the states could just do it by themselves. But for 10 years, during Congressional Reconstruction, there were Northern soldiers in the southern states ensuring that the 13th Amendment was being abided by. We'll see how this eventually ends in a later video. 1/5 of the population in the South were illiterate at the time, but we'll see that that didn't actually matter for many of the state legislatures. Going back all the way to the writing of the Constitution, James Madison said it didn't matter your education level, you would simply vote in your interests then too. 16 blacks would later on serve in Congress, We have Blanche Bruce here on the right, and Hiram Revels were two senators from Mississippi who were elected to the state legislature. There's a really cool story about Hiram Revels. I wonder if Hiram College is named after him. But he actually took the seat of the former Confederate of the United States, Jefferson Davis. So, I mean, just this contrast. The textbook talks about the day that Revels was sworn into office. Here is a black man taking the seat of the former Confederate of the United States. It's really incredible. And so there's remarkable stories of now blacks, former people who were slaves, could now serve in Congress. And also more than 600 blacks will serve in the state legislatures, again, going back to South Carolina. And again, this was happening under the protection of soldiers for 10 years, from 1867 to 1877. There's Congressional Reconstruction, where there are these stories of attempts to rewrite the laws, rewrite the constitutions, and more importantly, ensure that the 4 million newly freed men and women have an opportunity to pursue their own interests, to do what they want, to do what they like, as the United States continued on this story of Reconstruction. But what's going to happen when he goes away? What happens when the soldiers will leave? That's when Reconstruction will to effectively end. But it's not to diminish the remarkable attempts, the remarkable stories. We'll see more of them again when we talk about the legislature that was formed in South Carolina. But we should look at the prospects of Bruce of Revels and say, like, this is awesome. There was a chance that the nation would finally live up to its creed.